Let's talk about how societies evolve, how human culture changes across time, and introduce you to some new research called the World Values Survey. This is going to be a new model that we're going to bring in to help us to understand sociological issues, culture, society, the evolution of mankind, and your place in that as an individual. Because, of course, you're not just actualizing yourself as an individual. You're part of a community, part of a society, part of a culture, and all of that creates a very serious and crucial backdrop against which now you're trying to self-actualize, and it skews your epistemology, your metaphysics, and many other things. So this episode here is really a piece of the puzzle of what I call conscious politics. I have a 4-part episode series called Conscious Politics, where I go into a lot of depth on that. And this will be another puzzle piece in that to help you to understand why politics works the way that it works, and it'll help you to understand yourself. So let's get into that. But before we do, let's also reintroduce very quickly here the other two models we've talked about in the past that are going to be helpful here because there's going to be a lot of correlation. And the first one is spiral dynamics. Of course, hopefully you're familiar with that. If you're not, go see my 6-part or even more part series on spiral dynamics, many hours, over 10 hours, I talk about that model. It's a very sophisticated model which basically describes the development of human values. And here on the screen, you're going to see a slide of just the essence of what spiral dynamics is. So if you want a quick refresher to refresh your memory, there's stages here. There's 7 or so of these stages, different colors: purple, red, blue, orange, green, yellow, turquoise, moving upwards. As we move upwards, we encounter more complexity and a sort of a evolution of cultures and human value systems. And you can see there the various descriptions of what those different stages mean. I won't go over those again here. You should already be familiar with that. If not, go check out that many series, multiple part series. So we're going to be relying on this, keep this in mind. And also we're going to be relying on the old classic model of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So here you see it on the screen, the classic pyramid. You might have learned about this in high school or in college. I've talked about this in my episode called Using Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs to Self-Actualize. So basically what you see here is you see different levels of priority that the human organism and human society as well has in terms of what it needs to survive. At the very bottom, of course, you just have the basic stuff like food, water, sleep, sex, and so forth. And then as you satisfy those, of course, higher needs come online. The need for maybe a nicer shelter for a family, health. Then beyond that, you have friendship, sexual intimacy. Beyond that, you might have self-esteem needs, a need for achievement, a need to get respect of your colleagues and friends. And then beyond that, you have stuff like the need to be creative, the need to have freedom, to discover, to explore, to travel, to contribute to the world. And then at the very, very top, you have the self-transcendence needs, which is the need to move beyond your human identity and things such as truth, spirit, consciousness, being, and unconditional love. So keep all this in mind, because this will be very important for what we'll be talking about throughout this episode. So now let me introduce you to the World Values Survey. That's what it's called. Sometimes it's abbreviated as WVS. This is some groundbreaking and remarkable research that's been done over the last 40 years. And hardly anybody knows about it. They don't really talk about it in the news. When you listen to politics, nobody really talks about it. Nobody really knows about it. So I want to introduce this to you. This will help you to situate yourself and understand what's going on around you. It gives us important insights into human evolution and development. It explains culture and politics really well, so that culture and political debates no longer just devolve into left versus right or conservative versus liberal, but you see something deeper. This is sort of a meta-analysis of what's really going on and why these, culture wars and so forth happen that you see in the news. So this World Values Survey, this is a global research project spearheaded by a social scientist named Ronald Inglehart and many others alongside him, so by no means just himself. In fact, there are dozens and even hundreds of social scientists involved with this research. It's a very big project. One of the reasons it's so big is because it covers the whole globe. The other reason it's so big is because it covers a long chunk of time. So basically, they've been doing this survey from 1981 till 2020, and it's still ongoing. And every 4 years, they do a new wave of surveys to add on top of the database of data. So what are they really surveying here? Well, they're trying to ask people all around the world, ordinary people, basically what they think about fundamental issues such as the economy, the environment, gay rights, religion. Do you believe in God or don't you? About beliefs in science, about their ideas about what the right and best government should be, their satisfaction in life, and so on and so forth. And so they've been doing it since the 1980s. And the whole point of it is not just to gather the data once, but to keep regathering the data every 4 years in as many countries as feasible, and to get a picture of what the trends are. How are these values shifting over time, and what are the causes and effects and factors that lead to these values changing? And so we're going to be talking about that in a lot of great detail and giving you insights from that. In these surveys, over 100 countries are involved, which accounts for 90% of the world's population. So it's important to understand that these surveys are not just being done in first world developed countries in the West. These surveys are done all around the world in as many places as they can do it. It includes South America, it includes Asia, it includes Africa, it includes the Middle East, basically the whole world. And they're expanding it as far as they can. So it's very widespread. So of course, sometimes there's criticisms of surveys where it say, oh, well, this data only accounts for Western Europe or only for Americans. Well, here we want to make sure that we understand how all cultures evolve. We don't want to be chauvinistic, and we don't want to assume that the Western worldview or the European worldview is the only true one. And what you'll see in this data is that there's a lot of commonality, of course. There's nothing special per se about Europe or about America or about the white race that makes them more important than any other. We'll see that many of these trends are common across all these different countries. But of course, countries are at different levels of development. Countries are not all the same, and we do need to make those distinctions, which we'll be making. So how is this data collected? It's collected through questionnaires. So they have political and social scientists around the world who are responsible, who are volunteers, who go out there and administer these questionnaires in their local areas and countries. And then they bring it back to some central location where it's all compiled into a database, giant database of all the raw data. After the raw data is compiled over a period of 4 years, that constitutes a single wave. Then that data is released, and it's available for free to everybody who can then study it. And then you can see if you can find trends. You can create graphs and charts and do analysis on this data. We're going to be covering a lot of the analysis because we don't really care about the raw data itself here. We're more interested in the analysis of what the data means. And the particular people I want to give credit to here for some of the analysis that I'll be offering is Ronald Inglehart, of course, and his colleague Christian Welzel. They're central to some of the analysis that I'll be providing. So the World Values Survey Network, it's a network of scientists, has produced over 300 publications in 20 languages. And the World Values database, all the raw data, is published for free online. You can go and download it at worldvaluessurvey.org. All right, so that was sort of just a little bit of the preamble. Now let's get into the meat of what this is, and I'll be quoting a little bit here from Wikipedia, which describes and does a nice introduction to what we're talking about. Wikipedia says, quote, "The World Values Survey is a global research project that explores people's values and beliefs, how they change over time, and what social and political impact they have. The World Values Survey measures, monitors, and analyzes the following: support for democracy, tolerance for foreigners and ethnic minorities, support for gender equality, the role of religion and changing levels of religiosity, the impact of globalization, attitudes towards the environment, work, family, politics, national identity, culture, diversity, insecurity, and subjective well-being, otherwise known as happiness. Data from the World Values Survey has been used to better understand the motivations behind events such as the Arab Spring, the 2005 French civil unrest, the Rwandan genocide in 1994, and the Yugoslav wars and political upheaval in the 1990s. The World Values Survey has over the years demonstrated that people's beliefs play a key role in economic development, the emergence and flourishing of democratic institutions, the rise of gender equality, and the extent to which societies have effective government. End quote. That's all from the Wikipedia page about the World Values Survey. So now let's start showing you some of the charts and some of the data from the survey and start to do the analysis on this. So this is perhaps the most important thing that you need to know about this survey. And here on the screen, you're going to see a slide of the first set of data. So what we're doing here is we're mapping all the countries that we've surveyed onto two main axes, the horizontal and the vertical. On the horizontal x-axis, we have the survival versus the self-expression values. So that's going to be one key distinction. Is a nation predominantly survival-oriented or self-expression-oriented? And we'll explain that in a second. And then on the vertical axis, we have the y-axis. We have another dimension that we're going to use for mapping these different countries, which is traditional values versus secular-rational values. So some countries are more traditional, some are more secular and rational. So you can see that slide here. Now, what does this mean? Here's a description of traditional values. Countries that value traditional values emphasize the importance of religion, parent-child ties, deference to authority, and traditional family values. People who embrace these values also reject divorce, abortion, euthanasia, and suicide. These societies have high levels of national pride and generally a nationalistic outlook. Okay? And then that contrasts with secular rational values, which are the opposite, we might say, of traditional values. In these societies, less emphasis is placed on religion, traditional family values, and authority. So in these societies, it's not about obedience to authority. It's more about independent thinking and rationality. And in these societies, divorce, abortion, euthanasia, and suicide are seen as relatively acceptable. And then the next axis, of course, we have is the survival values versus the self-expression values. So here's what the survival values mean. In these countries, emphasis is on economic and physical security. It is linked with a relatively ethnocentric outlook and low levels of trust and tolerance, high corruption, and authoritarian styles of government. So in these countries, they are closer to poverty. They have more food shortages, and basic physical survival is more difficult. So if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you might say this is the bottom half of that pyramid, all the very fundamental stuff. How do you feed your children? How do you get a job? How do you get basic health care? How do you get access to food and water and such things? Electricity. And then that's contrasted with the self-expression values. So in these countries that are self-expressive, a high priority is placed on environmental protection, a growing tolerance for foreigners, gays, lesbians, and gender equality, rising demands for participation in decision-making in economic and political life. And these countries tend to be more democratic. So in these countries, it's the upper half of Maslow's hierarchy of needs because they've already satisfied the lower half, so then now they're working on the upper half. So these are the different dimensions that we can use to classify countries. Now, if you look at that slide, you can see how some of the countries are arranged. Basically, they're arranged into three tiers. There's the low-income countries, the mid-tier, and then the high-income countries. And this is just measured by GDP and per capita income. So let's just quickly list off some of these so that we're clear what we're talking about. So in the low tier, we have countries like Zimbabwe, Jordan, Morocco, Egypt, Bangladesh, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Thailand, India, Vietnam, Russia, Romania, Colombia, South Africa, Peru, Pakistan, Indonesia, Venezuela, China, Ukraine, and Guatemala. And by the way, even though we're classifying these countries, and we will be here, and we're going to be classifying different regions and peoples and even religions into like low, mid, and high tiers, be careful not to confuse this with some sort of racist secret agenda, right? We're not saying that these are bad countries. We're not saying that they are irredeemable. We're not saying that they can't outgrow the current position that they're in. We're just evaluating, stuff like objective measures of their wealth and corruption and other things like that. Now, the mid-tier are South Korea, Taiwan, Hungary, Croatia, Poland, Chile, Brazil, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Argentina, Uruguay, Malaysia, Hong Kong. Now, of course, I know Puerto Rico isn't a country of its own, but anyways, it's a region. So, and then we have the top tier: Germany, Japan, Italy, Spain, Ireland, the USA, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, France, Belgium, Norway, Finland, Netherlands, Denmark, Iceland, Switzerland, Sweden, Slovenia, the Czech Republic. Now, of course, these designations are somewhat arbitrary, somewhat subjective, depends on how you want to categorize them, but that just gives you a little bit of an idea of how countries can be classified in terms of their level of success, at least economically. And then we'll also be looking at culturally as well. We're going to be matching the economic and the cultural, and we'll see how it all interplays together. So it's not so simple to separate, for example, democracy from economic success and from cultural tolerance. These things tend to go hand in hand, which is why this data is so valuable. It shows us that. And we'll see more of that in a minute. So the less developed countries are more traditional and survival-oriented in their values. This is spiral dynamics stages purple, red, and blue. The lower three stages. And then the more developed countries tend to be secular, rational, and self-expressive in their values. And this is spiral dynamics orange, green, and yellow, and above. So why is this the case? That's what we'll be looking at. It's easy to think like, oh, well, yeah, of course, the unsuccessful countries are the religious ones. They're the religious fanatics. And the scientific countries, they're the more successful ones. And they're the ones associated with Western culture. It's much more nuanced than that. So be careful not to take that sort of arrogant position. We have to really take a look at what's going on here. So perhaps the most important thing that needs to be stressed now is the function of survival in driving all of these values and dynamics. Survival drives everything. People don't just adopt values willy-nilly. Your values are a survival strategy that the human organism and the superorganisms of your community and your tribe adopt in order to meet the survival challenges that you're facing. And survival is not just about keeping your body physically safe, as I talked about in my two-part series, Understanding Survival. If you haven't watched those two episodes, part 1 and part 2 of Understanding Survival, go watch those because that will change how you understand what survival is. Survival is a much more robust notion than just physical survival. It includes cultural survival. It includes survival of the self-image and identity that you have. And it brings in with it ideology, worldviews, dogmas, perspectives, biases, and so forth, that all of this plays into the survival of what you call yourself and what your society calls itself. So it's really about the survival of identities. See? So without meeting basic survival needs, you can't evolve and even care about self-expression needs. So of course it makes sense that before you go caring about creativity and art and truth and consciousness and all this sorts of stuff, first you got to be able to feed yourself and clothe your children. Pretty obvious. From Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we can see that. Just from your own life, you can see that. It's hard for you to care about the lofty stuff in life when you're struggling with very basic things. You got to take care of the basics and build upon that foundation. That's how life works, right? We are dealing with certain physical limitations and biological limitations when we're talking about life. Understand that people around the world, and even within your own country, in different regions of your country, especially if your country is large geographically, they face very different survival challenges. Not everyone faces your survival challenges. And one of the most tricky things to wrap your mind around here, especially for those of us who grew up in the luxury of first world developed countries, in opulent neighborhoods, if you had a good childhood where your parents took care of all your financial needs, basically, you never had a shortage of food, you never had a shortage of electricity and clean water, and all this sorts of stuff was taken care of for you. That is not most people's experience of life around the world. That's an exception to the rule. The rule is that many people, close to 40%, live near poverty, near starvation around the world. We just don't see it in the developed countries because we're sort of in our own little bubble. And if you are watching me, chances are you grew up in such a bubble. Now, of course, some of you did struggle with paying your bills and getting your food, and I totally understand that, in which case you have a little bit of a different appreciation for what real physical survival challenges are like. You're very familiar with the bottom half of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I know that many of you are struggling with that. Even in many developed countries, people still struggle with that. I understand that. But remember, we're generalizing here, and we're talking about sociological trends. So, survival challenges dictate one's beliefs, values, and worldview. That's crucial to understand. Most people take their beliefs, values, and worldview as a function of truth. Like, well, I believe in God, I'm a Christian because it's true. Or it's like, well, I'm a capitalist because it's true, because there's something valuable there, because I really believe in it. I'm a libertarian because, that's the right way to look at the world. This is a naive approach to life. When you start to study different perspectives and why people believe the things they believe, and what this data shows us from the World Values Survey, you start to see that actually your beliefs, values, and worldviews are almost entirely dictated by the survival situation that you grew up in. If you're a Christian only because you were raised in a Christian family in a Christian nation, most likely. Of course, there's a few exceptions here and there, but most likely. If you're a Muslim because you were raised in a Muslim part of the world, not because you independently derived Islam for yourself and independently of your own will decided to become a Muslim. You didn't have a choice about it. You were programmed to be a Muslim. And now here's the kicker that's difficult for many Westerners to swallow. If you're an atheist, rationalist, secular, scientifically minded person, that too is not something you arrived at independently. You didn't just decide to be that way. You are that way because you grew up in a culture in which having those beliefs, values, and that worldview was conducive to your survival. And you ain't doing anything original in taking on this worldview. Now, of course, all of us love to rationalize and justify to ourselves how actually, no, Leo, if I had a choice, I would choose the beliefs and values and worldview that I currently have. But that is the ego bullshitting itself. So we got to be careful to not fall into those traps. Your worldview and values isn't based on truth. It's what was necessary for you to survive. And that's a difficult pill for many people to swallow, to admit that. Just to admit that is very threatening, because it threatens to undermine your entire foundations of reality. Imagine admitting that your Christianity is contingent on something like where you were born. Not that it's true in any important way. And furthermore, imagine acknowledging that even your scientific worldview is also not true in any objective sense, but is contingent upon the culture you grew up in. See, people don't want to admit this. If you could admit this to yourself, you're already making some real good progress, because a lot of people get really stuck at this point. So I just wanted to point that out to you. And now we're going to really get into the analysis of some of the data. I'll be quoting extensively from Ronald Inglehart's book called Cultural Evolution. And I recommend that book. If you want, you can go purchase it and read it in detail. It explains a lot of this data. But for those of you who aren't going to go that deep, I'm going to pull out some of the best, juiciest quotes and then offer some of my analysis and commentary on them, especially sort of from my perspective, from my sort of higher consciousness experiences and understanding. So here we go. Quote, "A culture is a set of learned behaviors that constitutes a society's survival strategy. The norms governing this strategy usually change very slowly, often persisting for centuries. But under certain conditions, they can change rapidly. Though fashions change quickly, basic values tend to change slowly through intergenerational population replacement with multi-decade time lags." End quote. Let's pause and explain this, because this is very important. So as I was saying about survival, a culture as a whole, what is that? That is a collective survival strategy of millions of people. That's really what a culture is. Oftentimes we don't think about it this way. Oftentimes we think of culture as just something like, oh, well, those people over there do things one way, and these people over here do it another way. And it's kind of like, well, those people over there are weird. They have weird food, weird dress, weird customs, weird rituals, and we over here have our own. If you're an absolutist, you think yours is the best. If you're a relativist, you think that, well, different cultures have different pros and cons. But still, have you really contemplated and wondered what is a culture? And why are there different cultures? Why don't we all just have one culture? And the reason is because, of course, geographically and historically, we're trying to survive as humans and as clans and tribes in different geographies, different conditions in the world, which leads to different climate, different weather, different animals to eat, different plants to use for medicines, different humidity, different numbers of sunlight versus nighttime hours, depending on your latitude and longitude and all of that on the planet. Whether you're near an ocean or you're in a desert, all of these play huge factors which shape culture. For example, cuisine. Why does the Japanese cuisine contain a lot of raw seafood and seaweed and stuff like that? Well, because they live on an island and there's a lot of seafood around. You're not going to find a bunch of raw seafood in the Middle East. Why not? Because they live in a desert. There's not much to go around there. Difficult to keep that stuff from perishing when it's 100 degrees outside. See? So that's just a little example. But of course, there's a lot more. So all of the different rituals and cultural customs and even ways of dress, all of this is adapted to be an optimal survival strategy in that particular situation, in that particular part of the world. But of course, not just a part of the world, but also a certain slice of time. So the way you survived in Japan 1,000 years ago is not the same way that you survive in Japan today, even though the geography hasn't changed fundamentally. It's still the same in 1,000 years, not much geographical change. But see, what's unique about us humans is that our culture becomes its own ecosystem. So once we start to create culture, unlike other species, which mostly adapt to fit their environment, our environment becomes our culture. To survive today, you have to survive within a culture. To get a job, you have to fit in within the jobs and skill sets that your culture requires. Otherwise, you won't be having a profitable job. To find a mate, to start a family with, to have sex with, to spend your time with, this is all cultural. In different cultures, there are different ways to find mates. It might be an arranged marriage through social connections. It might be by paying a giant dowry to hire or to basically buy your bride. and to convince her family to allow you to marry her. And it might be like that, or it might be going to a nightclub and getting drunk and high on Molly, and that might be how you find your true love. Or it might be going to Burning Man, to some hippie festival in the middle of nowhere, and then there you find your true love. Different ways of finding your true love. And then, of course, different ceremonies for how to tie that knot, and different legal codes, and blah, 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 blah. But why all these differences? Because people are in different places, and also people have different environments, cultural environments, social environments that they're trying to navigate. And these environments, they're changing. They're not the same. The culture of Japan 1,000 years ago is not the one of today. The culture of America 50 years ago is not the culture of America today. And people forget this, and they tend to treat culture as a sort of a monolithic, static thing. It's not static at all. Culture evolves much quicker than the landscape upon which the culture was built. See? And we have to be adaptable to that. And what this World Values Survey data shows is that values change. They change to track the changes in the culture. See? And of course, technology plays a huge part in this as well, because as we develop new technology, our technology literally changes the landscape. We clear forests. We build skyscrapers and concrete jungle cities. We build suburbs. We build roads and highways and bridges and airplanes and airports and power plants and cars and computers. A lot of people these days are surviving online. We have a whole new dimension to survival, online survival. I'm one of those people. I get most of my money through online business. You see? So something that's sort of unreal, like the internet, you would say, well, how tangible is the internet? It's not very tangible. It's almost some sort of virtual space. On the other hand, if you do business through the internet, if you're a remote worker, that's huge for you. Your entire livelihood and survival depends upon having an internet connection. You see, literally, I'm tied to having a high-speed internet connection. I can't just go live on some island somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean because there's not going to be enough internet for me to even upload one of these episodes. And then how am I going to eat? Maybe I'll eat coconuts. See, I'll have to adapt. But that's exactly the point. And the trick, of course, is that people don't like to adapt. The mind is notoriously rigid and dogmatic and ideological. Once it adopts a set of values and a perspective and worldview, it doesn't like to change that. And so that's the part of this quote, the second part of the last part of this quote that's very important, which is he says that basic values change slowly through intergenerational population replacement and multi-decade time lags. So what this means is that we have generations. Basically, every 20 to 30 years is a new generation. So the time it takes from a baby to grow up and have its own baby, start its own family, that's about 20 to 30 years on average. And so, of course, what happens is that a baby is born, it gets programmed with all of the values of the culture and society that it's growing up in. It doesn't really have a choice. It just gets programmed through family, through religion, through going to church, through going to school, going to university, hanging with friends, going to work. All of that programs you as a baby and even as a teen and even as a young adult. So the first 20 years of your life, you're just being programmed like a robot. And then for the rest of your life, you're going to be acting out that programming and you're going to be very resistant to changing it. It's almost like setting a foundation for a house in concrete. Once that foundation is set, it's very difficult to change. And that's exactly how the human mind works. We've talked in the past about things like imprinting, how the mind can be imprinted, and then it gets stuck within those imprints and those beliefs, and it's very difficult to change those. So, if you were born into a Christian household and they baptized you from a very early age, and they read you Bible stories and so forth, that becomes the foundation of your sort of mental operating system that you use to understand the world. And it's going to be very difficult for you to ever transcend that completely in your life. It's set in stone. Now, that doesn't mean you can't transcend it if you really wanted to, but it'll take serious work, and most people won't do it. So what happens is that each generation sort of leapfrogs the previous generation, because when a new human is born, it's soaking up the new values of the culture, but there's a sort of a delay of 20 or 30 years between different generations. And so really, society inches along gradually like an inchworm, one generation at a time. And as one generation is born, an old generation dies. When the old generation dies, all of the values that it had and all of its worldviews die with it. And this is actually a very good thing because it frees up the sort of that ossified matrix. It makes it a little bit more fluid, and the new generation can come in. Of course, it'll take 20 or 30 years for the new generation to really come online, mature into adults, and then really have an impact in the world. And that's when we'll see those new set of values and worldviews start to shape the culture into something new. And this is how society moves forward. The next quote says, quote, historian Ian Morris, after examining a vast array of historical evidence, concludes that each age gets the thought it needs, with foraging, farming, and industrial societies developing appropriate value systems through an evolutionary process. End quote. See, so each age gets the thought it needs. So if you are in a foraging society, you're going to have worldviews and beliefs and morality and even spiritual practices which perfectly suit a foraging society. If you're in a farming society, you're going to have a different set which are suitable for farming. If you're in the internet age and you spend most of your time on social media, you're going to have a set of worldviews and beliefs that fit that. Getting this? The next quote is, quote, one of the most pervasive concepts in social science is that one's basic personality structure crystallizes by the time one reaches adulthood. Considerable evidence indicates that people's basic values are largely fixed when they reach adulthood and change relatively little thereafter. End quote. So that's exactly what I was describing with this sort of setting into concrete your mind's operating system. That's exactly what happens. And so what you have to appreciate is that whatever culture and social norms exist today right now, they are mostly enforced by the oldest generations in our society. And that if you want them to change, you basically have to wait for the older generations to die off to free up the space, the cognitive space, we might say, for new generations to come in and change that. Now, of course, the old generations they're capable of change, but by and large, they don't want to. They're stubborn, they're dogmatic, they think they're right, they're arrogant. Their minds are set in stone. Of course, there's always some exceptional older people whose minds are not set in stone, but that's an exception. Okay. Next, quote, the feeling that the world is secure or insecure is an early established and relatively stable aspect of one's outlook. When they are insecure, people give top priority to materialistic goals. End quote. Now, this is crucial again, because here's one of the most important factors in determining your worldview or outlook on the world. Did you grow up as a kid in a part of the world where you felt secure? Or did you grow up in a part where you felt insecure? Did you grow up in a war zone, or did you grow up in a nice suburb somewhere in California? This is huge. This shapes your entire outlook on the world. If you grew up in a war zone, you're basically going to treat the whole world as unsafe. You're going to have that paranoia with you for the rest of your life because you've seen firsthand how dangerous it is. And it was necessary for you to develop that sort of paranoia because that kept you alive in that war zone. Whereas if you grew up in a cushy, opulent suburb in California somewhere with a silver spoon in your mouth and your parents were millionaires, you're so out of touch with physical insecurity, the idea that you can go hungry, that you can run out of water or electricity or basic services, or the idea that there's no decent roads, or that the government is corrupt, or that the police are corrupt. These never even entered into your mind. So you grew up in such an idyllic environment that you take much of this survival for granted. And in a certain sense, this is a positive thing because you're not now paranoid. You don't think everyone is out to get you, to screw you over. You basically probably believe that people are nice and decent and that there's no reason to go to war. There's no reason to steal loaves of bread and so forth. Whereas someone who grew up in a war zone, to them, stealing loaves of bread, this was a necessity of survival. See? So these people have very different worldviews. And even if you take one of these insecure people and you transport them into a modern, luxurious environment where they have all their physical needs taken care of, deep down their psyche has not been instantly transformed. Their psyche is still insecure at some fundamental level, and that's going to affect how they vote, what kind of culture they subscribe to, what kind of ideas they have about democracy or authoritarianism, what kind of political people they support, and how their views on gay rights, their views on religion, and many other factors, right? So understand this. Survival is everything in determining your worldview. It's everything. It's so crucial. It's so much more crucial than people give it credit for. Next quote. There is a huge difference between growing up knowing that survival is insecure and growing up and taking survival for granted. End quote. So that's exactly what I was just explaining. It's nice to be able to grow up taking survival for granted. In a sense, we need that because that's what actually ultimately leads to the progression and evolution of culture. Culture used to be a lot more brutish, violent, and unfair because 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, almost everybody was living in a part of the world which was insecure. But as we develop more technology and more material wealth, as we build better infrastructure, better bureaucracies, better governments, we craft new constitutions which give more civil rights and all of this, and we create better government. As we do that, we're moving out of insecurity towards security. As we become more secure, we're afforded luxuries like compassion and empathy and caring about social justice and democracy and all of these sorts of quote-unquote luxuries that many of us take for granted in first world countries. It's difficult for someone who grew up in a first world country to appreciate that democracy isn't just something that comes about naturally or organically. Not everyone is just born believing in democracy or freedom of speech or equal rights for men and women or tolerance of homosexuality or appreciation of science. These are things that had to be hard fought for over millennia and over centuries. You, in a sense, if you're living in a first world country, you're standing on the shoulders of giants on a pyramid or on a pyramid of the corpses of millions of your ancestors, all the old generations. It's almost like in geology, they have different sediments. You can slice through a mountain. There's different sedimentary layers. Well, that's how human society is too. In developed societies, advanced societies, we have many, many layers that we take for granted. But those layers are absolutely crucial. As soon as those layers stop to function, everything falls apart. See? And also you need to understand that in other parts of the world where those layers haven't been built up yet, well, you can expect that they won't be able to appreciate some of the things you appreciate because you already have those layers in place. See? You might go to some place like in Saudi Arabia and you might wonder, oh my God, it's so barbaric there. They sentence homosexuals to death and they barely even let women drive. And women have to wear these these black burqas that cover their whole body. It seems so crude and barbaric. Why don't they just throw a party at the pool and everyone's walking around in bikinis and listening to pop music? It's like, no, you don't get it. They haven't developed themselves to that as a culture. See? This is a matter of life and death for them. It's not just a matter of like, oh, yeah, let's just be nicer to women. No, 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 no. You have to understand that in Western cultures, we also had those same things. Just, it might have been hundreds of years ago, it might have been thousands of years ago, but we had the same sorts of attitudes. We've just evolved, and they evolved less. Now, why did they evolve less? That's a different issue. And we're not going to tackle that too much here, but suffice it to say that it's not because they're an inferior race. There's a lot of geological, geographical factors, and just historical developmental factors involved there. So it's not that one culture is better than another culture. Every culture has its pros and cons. Some cultures develop faster than others in different environments depending on all the factors involved. There's thousands of factors involved. There's no one single factor to explain it. Let's keep quoting here. Quote, individuals under stress yearn for rigid, predictable rules. They want to be sure of what's going to happen because survival is precarious and their margin of error is slender. Conversely, people raised under conditions of relative security can tolerate more ambiguity and have less need for the absolute and rigid rules that religions provide. People with relatively high levels of existential security can more readily accept deviations from familiar patterns than people who are uncertain that their survival needs will be met. End quote. So this is crucial as well. See, you might wonder, how is it possible that in certain less developed parts of the world, they actually vote for autocrats and tyrants into office? How come they're not all clamoring for democracy? Because democracy is actually something that is a luxury that comes later. If you or your society and your culture are under a serious existential threat, like there's a threat of war or invasion, you will gladly take an authoritarian or a dictator and throw out democracy and free speech. And you will impose rigid rules because the most important thing for you is survival, not free speech, not individual liberties. Those are all luxuries that come only once you've handled your basic survival. See? So people who are on the brink of starvation, they're much more open to rigid rules. They're much more open to strong men and leaders who can come and take charge and try to lead them out of that situation. So the crucial mistake that many Westerners and so forth make is they look at an autocrat or a dictator somewhere and they say, oh my God, it's so terrible. He's so evil. How could he oppress his fellow countrymen that way? No, you don't get it. That's not what's going on. It's not that he's evil. It's that the conditions, the survival conditions in that part of the world at that time in human history are such that the citizens themselves put forth such a person to take charge and lead them out of that situation. In that situation, your simple democracy doesn't work. For a democracy to work, you need to have some rule of law. Democracy doesn't work when I can grab an AK-47 and just go shoot your family. You can't have a democracy that way. And there are many parts in the world where that's how issues are settled. Rather than going to court, people come at each other with knives and with guns, with pitchforks. See? You have to develop a court system. You have to develop a police system which is not corrupt in order to handle these sorts of issues such that then we can go to a forum, a public square, and debate out our differences democratically, so to speak. And then we can go to a voting booth and vote democratically for something, right? To be able to vote democratically, there need to be unintimidated voters. The voters need to have a certain level of education. They need to be literate. They need to be able to read the names on the ballots. And all of this might seem so basic that you might think that everyone has this, but no. Just a few hundred years ago, the majority of the world's population was illiterate. I don't know what the rate is now, but it's still substantial. Next quote. Threats increase the need for strong norms and punishment for deviant behavior to maintain order. Tight societies with autocratic governing systems that suppress dissent provide strong deterrence and control of crime and tend to be more religious. Nations that encountered severe ecological and historical threats have relatively strong norms and low tolerance for deviant behavior. End quote. So this explains a lot of why, like, for example, in the Middle East, they have very low tolerance for homosexuality, for feminism. They can be quite xenophobic, and so forth. And they're also very, very religious, is because that religion is a sort of a binder. It binds people together into a nation or into a tribe or into a clan, and it keeps people aligned, thinking in a certain direction, valuing the same things. One of the greatest challenges is managing a group of people whose values are incoherent with each other. You know, one person believes he can do this, another person believes he can do that, and there's 1,000 such people. How do you get so many people to work together against a common enemy? Let's say we have a tribe of 1,000 people, and we're gonna have invaders coming in next month. Well, what's gonna happen if, you know, I decide to just go spend the next month having sex? Somebody else decides to go spend the next month playing video games. Somebody else decides to spend the next month, you know, starting a business. We're gonna get exterminated. We need to get together. We need to come up with a common set of values and things we can agree upon that will bind us together so that we can act as one larger unit of 1,000 to fend off this invader. We're going to build a wall. We're going to build weapons, whatever, to do it. You see? So under these conditions, you don't have the luxury to just go and play video games or go have sex with whoever you want, or to be homosexual, or to advocate for women's rights and so forth. And I'm not justifying these things as proper. I'm just saying this is simply what's required to survive in that particular situation. If it is. Sometimes it isn't required, but sometimes it is. See? So in these sorts of societies where they're closer to physical danger, where they're not as secure, they tend to be a lot more conformist. There's a lot less individual expression or room or tolerance for that. You follow the norms, you obey authority, because the authority is the thing that keeps you alive. Whether it's the church authority or the government authority, or even a local authority like a chieftain or an elder. Next, quote, submission to authority has high costs. The individual's personal goals must be subordinated to those of others. Under conditions of insecurity, people are willing to do so. Under threat of invasion, civil war, or economic collapse, people tend to seek strong military figures who can protect them from danger. Conversely, prosperity and security are conducive to tolerance of diversity. This helps explain a long-established finding that rich societies are much likelier to be democratic than poor ones. Under conditions of insecurity, people may readily submit to authoritarian rule. End quote. Which is just what I was describing. So next here, I want to show you a chart. And this chart here on the horizontal axis shows the percent emphasizing self-expression values. And then on the vertical axis, it shows the level of effective democracy in the country. And what we can see here is a very clear trend that those countries which have the most effective democracies, which means the democracy is the least corrupt, it works the best for the most people. In those countries, countries such as Finland, New Zealand, Canada, Australia, Switzerland, Denmark, the United States, the United Kingdom, Iceland, so forth, in these countries, they have a very strong emphasis on self-expressive values. These are values of free speech, individual rights, the right to liberty, life, and happiness, all that sort of stuff. The stuff in the Constitution, civil rights, and so forth. Whereas countries like Zimbabwe or Pakistan or Jordan or Bangladesh, in these countries, democracy is very ineffective. There's virtually no democracy there. They're highly corrupt. And of course, they emphasize survival values, not self-expression values, because they're struggling just to maintain themselves. And then in the next slide here, this is some data which is completely separate from the World Values Survey, but I wanted to introduce it here anyways, because it correlates nicely. This is some data from the Transparency International organization. This is the 2018 Corruption Perceptions Index, the CPI, they call it. So this is a number from 0 to 100. So this nonprofit organization basically tracks and monitors the corruption levels of police, courts, and governments in all countries around the world. And they give a number from 0 to 100, 0 meaning totally corrupt, 100 meaning squeaky clean. And you can see what this looks like. And you can see that many of the Western countries, especially Northern European countries, countries in North America, are some of the least corrupt. Australia, New Zealand, these are some of the least corrupt countries. And then the most corrupt countries are often in parts of Asia, of course, a lot in Africa, South America, Russia, Eastern Europe, and so on. And this correlates very nicely with the World Values Survey data, because the more corrupt your country is, the less democracy it has, and vice versa. And here in the following slide is the same data, but now just displayed in a different way. You can see the different levels of democracy and how countries are arranged here. And the corruption index is going horizontally, and then vertically is the different levels of democracy. So there's full democracy, flawed democracy, hybrid regimes, and autocratic regimes at the very bottom. Those 4 levels you can see going horizontally across. So yeah, it's pretty self-explanatory there. And you can see just how well full democracy tracks with low corruption, and just how well high corruption tracks with autocratic regimes down at the very bottom at the left. All right, so let's do some more quotes. Quote, economic development brings systematic changes in a society's beliefs and values. 40% of the world's population is moving from starvation-level poverty to a modest level of economic security. All of the low-income and lower middle-income societies, again, without a single exception, fall into the lower left-hand zone, which is the traditional /survival value-oriented worldview. That's a very clear correlation from this data. Quote, low-income societies remain solidly opposed to gender equality and tolerance of gays. End quote. Why is this? Is it because they're ignorant and closed-minded and evil and bad people? No. It's because in a low-income society, maintaining that strong family unit, that traditional family unit, is very important to be able to survive. See? And in these societies, there's clear delineations of roles for genders. The woman is supposed to take care of the kids. The man is supposed to take care of the woman and the kids by going to work. And this is just how it's arranged, because that's how it has to be arranged to survive in that environment, in those conditions. Now, of course, as you outgrow that, as the environment and conditions change, as society becomes more technological, a man no longer needs to support the family so much. The woman is able to support herself and her kids more, because technology equalizes that physical difference between the strength of, the brute physical strength between men and women, which on average exists. And then there's more tolerance for homosexuality in more advanced societies, because now it's not so important to raise 8 children to help you to maintain your farm. Now you can be sexually promiscuous, and you can even not have children, and that's considered okay, because the society already has a massive population by that point. It's overpopulated. So it's not so important to breed like rabbits. You can sustain yourself even with 1 or 2 children or no children. There are systems in place that when you get old, you don't need children to take care of you. You can earn enough money to put it in a bank account, put it in some IRA, and then live off that savings, get an annuity, live off of it, and retire, live in a retirement home. But you see, in low-income societies, there are no retirement homes. The children have to take care of the parents when they get old. See? So having lots of children is their insurance policy. In a developed society, we have Social Security. In a low-income society, the Social Security is having 8 children and not being gay. That's the Social Security. Now, again, make sure you don't misunderstand me. I am not justifying homophobia. I'm not making any judgments about it one way or another. I'm not saying it's good or bad, right or wrong. I'm just explaining where it's coming from. It's a survival thing. Your worldview is a survival thing. And if you're homosexual, realize that that's only because you're living in a certain society that allows you to be openly homosexual. That's a luxury. Probably in most other times and places in the world, you would have had to keep that deeply under wraps, because if they found out, you would have been excommunicated, demonized, tarred and feathered, or even executed or locked in jail. Which is not to say there weren't homosexuals 2,000 years ago. Of course they were, but it was just treated very differently. Even homosexuals themselves thought of themselves very differently 2,000 years ago than the way they think today, because worldviews have evolved. Even homosexual people have evolved their own worldviews about themselves. That's all part of cultural evolution, and that's all part of survival. Next, quote, people who experience threats to themselves and their families or their communities during their formative years tend to be far more religious than those who grew up under safer and more predictable conditions, end quote. So this is big, because religion is one of the strongest forces for unifying people under one common banner or umbrella of values. Religion helps to set up a moral system that people can agree upon, which is why religion plays such a huge survival function. Religion is not just people the way that some atheists portray it, or some rationalists portray it, is like, oh, well, religion is just believing in the flying spaghetti monster because you're stupid and because you don't want to think rationally about the world. No. Religion is a very powerful mind control device that gets disparate people to come together and to create a proto-legal system. Because without religion, how do you get people to agree on what's right and what's wrong? You might say, oh, that's obvious. Just, Leo, you can be an atheist and you can still be moral. You don't need to be religious to be moral. Maybe not. But still, that relativism, this idea that you can just say, well, cannibalism, is it really wrong, or is it sort of just something that we invented? To even have the luxury to consider that maybe cannibalism is something that's only relatively wrong and not absolutely wrong, or to consider that homosexuality is only relatively wrong and not absolutely wrong. Those sorts of considerations already are only possible in advanced societies that have already met their survival needs. You see. So one of the functions of religion, and for example, a lot of people criticize Islam as being a negative force in the world. But these people don't really understand the function that Islam played back when it was invented. Islam wasn't invented today. Islam was invented in 400 AD or something like that in the Middle East. Totally different survival conditions. At that time there in the Middle East, it was tribal warfare. It was tribes slaughtering other tribes. They didn't even have the ability to set up a nation that could defend itself. Why not? Because you had so many different tribes. All these tribes had their own clan alliances and allegiances and identities, and they couldn't even agree with each other about the fact that it's not right to kill people. You see? So there was so much bloodshed going on there, Islam was a unifying force that was able to unify the different tribes in the Middle East and allow them to advance to become larger nation states and countries. See, it created a sort of a moral code to which everybody in that very conflicted region could agree to. And then by following these strict rules, they were able to reach a new level of peace and prosperity. Now, of course, today you might look at it and say, well, but today the Middle East is one of the least developed regions of the world. That's right. But you have to always look at it within the context historically as it developed. So it doesn't really matter where it's at today. Today, it might not be so developed, and maybe today Islam is holding the Middle East back. Maybe it is. But you also have to consider what would happen if you got rid of it, or if it wasn't there in the first place. It might be much worse. Always consider that if you get rid of something in society you think isn't necessary, that might actually make things much worse than you assume they would be. Now you say, well, why can't they just become atheists? They could, of course, but that will take them more evolution to get there. And of course, the challenge with survival is precisely that those rigid systems you create at one level of survival to survive, you're going to have to transcend those and release and detach from those to reach the next level of survival, and so on and so on and so on. That's what all of spiral dynamics is about. Each stage, to ascend up each stage, you have to let go of the previous stage. You have to recognize its limitations. You have to sort of detach from it. But that the mind's ability to detach is quite rare. Most minds attach to stuff and don't let go until they're dead. You see? So this is what's going on. Here's a chart that shows on the horizontal axis, we have same-sex legislation scale, which basically shows you how lenient legislation is in various countries, or their attitude towards sex, how permissive they are. And then on the vertical axis is whether these are self-expressive values or based sort of traditional values. And what you see here is clearly how the different countries align. Countries like in Sweden, Norway, Canada, Spain, and so forth, basically same-sex marriage has been legalized. And then in countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Bangladesh, and so forth, you get the death penalty basically for homosexuality. So it just shows you the differences very clearly. And keep in mind, whatever you think, if you take this attitude that, well, I live in an advanced country and we are so much better than all the other countries, so much more advanced, keep in mind that that's only a recent development. If you rewind the clock 500 years, even the most progressive countries of today would look a lot like Saudi Arabia and Iran. So just keep that in mind. If you are in an advanced country today, it's not because you are just part of some master race of people who are smarter, wiser, more compassionate by default. No, it's because you've already gone through all that other stuff. You've gone through the barbarity that certain other countries are still struggling with today. You're a little bit further ahead. That doesn't actually make you better. You see, you're basically just standing on the shoulders of giants that came before you. Next, quote, in traditional societies, up to 95% of the public say that God is very important in their lives. Yet in secular rational societies, as few as 3% do. In survival-oriented societies, up to 96% of the public say that homosexuality is never justifiable, and in self-expression-oriented societies, as few as 6% do. End quote. So you see, this is not just merely a matter of like, do you believe in the flying spaghetti monster? This is life and death stuff. And if you don't see it as life and death stuff, that's because you already have your life and death stuff taken care of. And you have the luxury to not look at it as life and death stuff. And then you can start to make arguments about flying spaghetti monsters, and you can start advocating for homosexual rights and women's rights and all this sorts of good stuff, only because we've gotten to that point. Because there's bureaucratic systems, there's education systems, there's technology, there's all this stuff. There's a decent economy that enables this. There's a lack of threat from the outside. Your nation isn't being invaded. There's no threat of you getting raped and butchered and murdered. These are real threats that many people face in the world. If you don't face the threat of rape, murder, genocide, theft on a daily basis, you're living the good life. Appreciate what you have. That's not how it was for most of mankind, for most of mankind's history. Quote, "The shift from survival values to self-expression values also includes a shift in child-rearing values, from emphasis on hard work towards emphasis on imagination and tolerance as important values to teach children." End quote. So this is a good way to see where's a person at. You can ask someone, like ask your friend, for example, if you have children, would you prioritize teaching them hard work, or would you prioritize teaching them imagination and tolerance? What you'll find is that if your friend is highly developed and lives in a developed country, grew up in a developed country, and feels secure about his survival or her survival, then they will tell you that, of course, imagination and tolerance is much more important than hard work. But if your friend is from some poor, struggling country, they will tell you hard work is everything. And imagination and tolerance, that's some fluffy bullshit stuff that is intangible. That's some woo-woo stuff. Which is why, for example, parents in India and in China, they drive their children like slave masters. They push their children to get solid, well-paying jobs, engineering jobs, computer programming jobs, doctor jobs, lawyer jobs. Why? Because those parents come from these countries like India and China, which were at poverty levels 40 years ago. They still have huge poverty today, but 40 years ago, it was even worse. Millions of people in China and in India die from poverty. So for them, these parents, the worst thing that they can imagine for their children is that their children end up in poverty. So of course they push their children to work extra hard, study extra hard, get college degrees, get good, well-paying jobs. And when you tell one of these parents that you want to become a philosopher or an artist or a musician or a poet, what do? They can't take you seriously. Because from their point of view, survival trumps everything. And to them, survival means you got to be a doctor or a lawyer to earn good money. Otherwise, you ain't surviving. So these parents are looking out for their children, but also what these parents don't realize is that survival conditions change. So China and India today are not as bad as they were 40 years ago. There is more opportunity to be an artist, to be a poet, to follow your dreams, to be more imaginative, to be more tolerant. Of course, there's more opportunity for this. But there's also still dangers. It is still possible that you get some philosophy degree and then you end up broke and then, come begging your parents for money, which they may not have, and then you become homeless, and then what? See? But if you grew up in a country where your parents are rich, have plenty of money, then your parents will not push you hard to be working all the time. They will give you more of a push to be more imaginative, more artistic, more tolerant, and more liberal, generally speaking. Next quote, "People who emphasize survival values tend to be significantly less satisfied with their lives and less happy than people with self-expression values." End quote. So this is an important point, which basically says that there is a clear trend and a reason for why societies move from survival values to self-expression values. Because it increases happiness overall. As a human, you don't get much satisfaction from just meeting your basic survival needs, from eating, shitting, having sex, going to work. this produces a relatively mild level of satisfaction. The true satisfaction in life is found when you can be artistic, creative, free to pursue your life purpose and your vision for the world. When you are free to be spiritual, not in some stifled religious way, but you can be spiritual in your authentic way, the way that's true for you. See? But these things are luxuries for most people. So don't take that for granted if you have these opportunities. Which is where self-actualization comes into play. Self-actualization is basically what you do after you've satisfied the majority of your basic survival needs. Then you start to ask the question, what's next? What do I do with my life? How do I impact the world? How do I be creative? How do I live a life of purpose? How do I help uplift others? How do I grow myself? Cognitively, morally, spiritually? How do I educate myself to higher levels? How do I understand more of the world? How do I become more conscious? How do I find out what the truth is? Where did reality come from? All these sorts of questions now become important to you. Whereas before, it was just about eating, shitting, having sex, making money. So here's a chart which shows and maps the GDP on the horizontal axis. This is per capita GDP. Basically, this is the wealth of the country per person, per citizen. And then on the vertical axis is life satisfaction mean score, which is just basically how happy are people in this country. So what you can clearly see is that the people with the highest happiness, the countries with the highest happiness, basically tend to be the wealthier countries. There's a correlation there. And then at the very bottom of this chart, the bottom left, you see basically the poorest countries, and they have the lowest life satisfaction scores, which makes sense. I mean, if you live in Iraq, in some war-torn part of the world, it's going to be harder for you to be happy because it's harder for you to get access to basic things that you need, and it's harder for you to live from your heart and to follow your heart without a bunch of restrictions. But also notice what this chart shows. It shows that for the bottom half of this chart, basically, what this kind of curve shows is that for countries which are lower income and have weak economies, for them, one of the fastest ways to raise the happiness of everyone in that country is to build better infrastructure and develop a higher economy that works for everybody more equally. That is the fastest way to raise your happiness there, on average. But then countries who are towards the second half of the chart, in these countries, you can raise the economy more, but you're going to get diminishing returns in terms of satisfaction and happiness. So once you have most of your basic needs met, at that point, chasing more money, chasing luxury is not going to lead to a lot of fulfillment. And that's what a lot of movie stars and wealthy people discover. Because after a certain amount of money, more money doesn't really do anything for you. Then you need to be switching over to self-actualization work, to spiritual work, to growing yourself, to contributing back to society. That's where the real fulfillment comes from, not from a better economy, which is one of the reasons why in American politics, for example, many politicians in America push for, more capitalism, even better economy. And while I can understand that many people in America do want more job opportunities, and many people in America are still struggling with poverty and so forth, don't forget, we even have poverty in America. And in Europe, it still exists. But still, this emphasis on just never-ending growth of the economy, never-ending growth of the stock market, this becomes counterproductive after a while. And what a lot of Americans need is not more of the economy. What they need is they need more personal development work, which really is getting badly neglected as we go chasing material success. So be careful about that. But also, what this chart shows you is that if you are in a country where you're struggling materially, there's nothing wrong with handling your basic material needs. You need some of that in order to have a sort of a foundation from which you can do the rest of the work. And I do see this problem with some of my students. Some of you guys I know are in underdeveloped countries. Some of you are from Iraq. Some of you are in Iran. Some of you are in the Middle East or in Asia somewhere, or even in Africa. And hey, I totally get it. It's much harder to self-actualize from those countries. You don't have the same resources. You don't have the same economic power. It's hard for you to even like buy a self-help course because your money is so devalued relative to a country that would have produced a self-help course in the first place. You know, like you're not going to find a self-help course made in Africa. For the most part, self-help courses are made in America or in Europe. See? And you're going to have to be paying dollars or euros for it. And your African currency is not going to match up very well against dollars and euros. You might not even be able to afford a course like this. That's right. That makes it harder for you. Now, of course, don't turn this into a limiting belief. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it is harder, and it's important for us to acknowledge that it's harder. So don't let people gaslight you. If you're in India, if you're in China, if you're somewhere in the Middle East, yeah, you're going to have a more difficult time studying my work and embodying my work, because chances are that your family and your culture are going to be at such a low level of development, and also economically, there's going to be less opportunity for you. So because of this, you're going to struggle with more basic survival needs, and people will judge you more for deviating from traditional cultural values. Your parents won't understand this thing called non-duality. Good luck convincing your friends and your family that you're God when you awaken. They won't be so understanding because they can barely tolerate homosexuality, let alone the idea that you're God, even though you are, even though they are. But hey, they're not at a level where they can open their minds to that. So it will be harder. And of course, one of the best things you can do if you're in one of these poorer countries, and if you really care about self-actualization, is find some way to move to a better country. But if you can't, and I understand many of you can't or don't want to, then you can still improve yourself greatly. It'll just be more difficult. All right, so just let's acknowledge that. All right, this next chart I have for you shows some trends of where countries and parts of the world have moved over the last few decades in terms of their values. So we can see, for example, Japan has made a big leap from survival to self-expression values. And then Protestant Europe as well, Catholic Europe a little bit less, English-speaking countries as well. But then there are some countries that actually you can see some regressions. For example, Russia, you can see a serious regression from secular rational values to traditional values. And the reason that is because under communism, it was sort of dictated from above that God was outlawed, religion was outlawed in all of Russia, for example, the entire USSR. So once that collapsed in the early 1990s, then traditional values, Orthodox Christianity came back into full force there because it was never really transcended or outgrown. It was merely suppressed from up high. So that's what explains, for example, the Russian trends. In China as well, China has been dealing with a lot of poverty and a lot of political upheaval, so that explains why there's a little bit of regression there. But overall, also, China has done a lot to secure its survival in the last 60 years, let's say. And so oftentimes when you see this sort of regression from secular rational values to traditional values, that's when nationalism also becomes a powerful force in politics. So we can see nationalism in Russia, we can see nationalism in China, we can see nationalism in ex-communist Europe, we can see nationalism on the rise in India as of late. We can see nationalism on the rise, for example, in Brazil. So do keep that in mind. And one of the things that leads to the rise of nationalism is a situation where people feel that their survival is more threatened. So, for example, when the economy starts doing worse, people are much more likely to go nationalistic because basically they're operating out of fear and they're looking for some strong authoritarian to come in and rally them together and to maybe push something through. But oftentimes, of course, this ends up backfiring and they end up regretting it in the long run. kind of like with Nazi Germany. All right, let's keep going here. Quote, life expectancies, incomes, and school attendance rose from 1970 to 2010 in every region of the world. Poverty, illiteracy, and mortality are declining globally, and war, crime rates, and violence have been declining for many decades. End quote. So this is important to acknowledge. Sometimes people bemoan that society is regressing, especially lately with the rise of Trump or various nationalist movements around the world. People, turn on the news and they see all this negative stuff on the news and they say, oh my God, the world is going to hell. The world is not really going to hell. The world right now is the best it's ever been. It's the freest it's ever been. It's the wealthiest it's ever been. It's the more fair and just than it's ever been. And you might say, well, Leo, that's crazy. We have high income inequality. We still have plenty of racism and homophobia and xenophobia and nationalism and all this. How could you possibly say that? Well, you're not appreciating just how much worse it used to be. Culture and society is always progressing forward, even when there are temporary setbacks, and there can be some serious temporary setbacks, but it's always progressing forward towards higher consciousness, higher complexity, and higher love. And that's something that's challenging to explain to you if you don't have a high enough perspective to see that. But that is the case. That is the trend. And that's what can keep you optimistic and hopeful about mankind, is that we are progressing forward. Now you might say we're not progressing forward fast enough. Well, of course, fast enough, slow, this is relative. Fast enough compared to what? Compared to your lifetime, maybe. But then again, culture changes quite a lot. Like even just in America, take a look at our politics. 20 years ago, the idea of legalization of recreational marijuana, this was opposed by the majority of people and it was considered outrageous and wrong. And today, the trends have completely flipped. And likely in the next 10 years, America will legalize marijuana at a federal level because we've already done it in many of the states. And it seems to be working fine. People are happy with it. There seems to be no problem. Even many of the conservatives are now not really against banning marijuana. Views have changed in the last 20 years on that issue. Same thing with gay rights. 20 years ago, the idea of gay marriage, even in liberal circles, many liberal politicians, Democratic politicians, would have laughed you out of the room to say that we would have gay marriage recognized by the Supreme Court. And today it is. And today, even many conservatives and Republicans basically have resigned themselves to accept that gay marriage is a thing. It's not going away any time soon. Gay rights are just going to become more robust. I mean, it's just like you can't put that genie back in the bottle. And this is happening on many levels. Now, of course, there are some regressive trends, especially with Trump and the conservatives in power now. Yes, there's regressive trends, but you have to have a long time horizon. You have to see that these regressive trends will play themselves out, and these regressive trends are merely a launching point for even more progressive trends coming in the future. And why do I say this with such certainty? Is it because I'm some bleeding heart liberal and social justice warrior? No, it's because look at the data. Look at the data. Look at human history. Look at what's been happening over the last 2,000 years of human history. We went from being complete animals and barbarians to being animals and barbarians only part-time. That's big progress. Now you might say, oh, 2,000 years, that's a long time. Well, relative to your lifetime, it's a long time, but actually it's pretty quick in the evolutionary time. So actually, even though it seems like progress is slow, it's much faster than anything else evolution has done that we know about. Technology is advancing very quickly. Culture is advancing quite quickly. It's advancing so quickly that actually we have these regressive nationalist movements. Why do we have them? Because the culture is advancing so quickly to try to keep pace with the technology, which is advancing even quicker, that a lot of people are being left behind and they're scared. What's going to happen with automation? How do we handle, legalization of drugs and homosexuality and sexual promiscuity and all this sort of stuff? How do we deal with birth control pills and women having control over their reproductive body and going to work, all of these things. These are relatively new developments that many people are still like struggling to wrap their mind around, because most people have very simple minds that are not processing all of this information. Most people go to school, maybe they finish college, and then that's it. That's the end of their education. They don't learn anymore. They don't grow anymore. Now they coast off of that. And they look for ways to validate and entrench themselves in their worldview. They're living in a bubble of their friends, and they have to live that way in a sense because that's how they survive as the kind of self that they are. For them to survive in a different way, you could say, well, Leo, can't they just grow? They can grow, but that means they'd have to face the fear of surrendering their ego self, which of course they don't want to do. Can Christians outgrow Christianity? Of course, but that means they have to die as a Christian identity. Do they want that? No, that's the last thing in the world they want. They're terrified of that. Therefore, we have Christianity being dogmatic. Same thing with Islam. Same thing with scientism. Same thing with atheists. Same thing with rationalists. So don't think that this is all just something to blame on simple-minded, primitive religious people. No. Scientific people face exactly the same challenges, just on a slightly higher level. Next quote. If economic collapse occurs, cultural changes start to move in the opposite direction. So we've already touched on that. Next quote. 2/3 of the average country's respondents fall within one standard deviation of their country's mean score on both dimensions, and 95% fall into 2 standard deviations. Despite globalization, nations remain an important unit of shared experience, and the predictive power of nationality is much stronger than that of income, education, region, or sex. End quote. Now, this is an important point. So it's a little technical here. He talks about standard deviations. All this really means is that if you're within a country, the similarity you share within the country with your fellow citizens is much stronger than the similarity between, for example, your same gender in a different country or your same religion in a different country. See? And the reason that is because each country basically has its own national education system. This education system indoctrinates children, and it indoctrinated you with a set of values, a shared set of values, which sort of define what that country is, a certain language, a set of values, a certain religious orientation, or a secular one, if that's what your country is into. And that creates a sort of a shared experience of your fellow citizens, which is distinctly different from that of some other faraway country, or even a neighboring one, for that matter. See? So you might think that women living in America have a lot in common with women living in India because they're both women. And you would think like, well, women are all women, so all women should be for feminism and women's rights, right? Because in America, women are for feminism. I mean, the majority of them are for gender equality. And, they stress the importance of gender equality. But in India, many women are not. And you might wonder, why is that? That's because totally different levels of development, totally different education systems, totally different cultures, you see? So it's not just about breaking people down in terms of gender, income, education, or sexuality. A lot more depends upon their values. It's much more accurate to break people down across their values. Are they survival value oriented, or are they self-expression value oriented? Are they traditional value oriented, or are they secular rational value oriented? These are far better dividing lines than something like gender. Next, quote, individualism is not a static individual level psychological attribute. It is shaped by a society's level of development. Modernization facilitates a shift away from collectivism towards individualism, bringing increasing emphasis on individual autonomy, weakening traditional hierarchical norms. End quote. So this one is for you libertarians out there who tend to treat everyone as an individual and think that everyone is just individually responsible for themselves. No, it's never really been this way. This is a modern development. Individualism is only facilitated by collectivism. You can only be an individual in a modern society because of all the technology and all of the bureaucracy that has been built up by government. This is the chief absurdity of libertarianism. This idea that we should do away with government and all just live as individuals. No, if you do away with government, you can only live as a tribe. You're going to have less individualism when you get rid of government, not more. If you take a look at primitive tribes, they're extremely collectivist. There's no room for individualism in some Amazonian tribe. There, your entire sense of individualism is erased and you're part of a giant tribal unit. You don't think of yourself as an individual there. You're not going to have a libertarian philosophy in one of these tribes because in these tribes can only survive in the middle of the Amazon when they work together. And they share collective responsibilities. They live as a commune, which is sort of the last thing that some of these libertarians want. It's only because of how far we've come that today you can be an alienated individual in a developed first world country and you can sit at home on the internet, earn your money off the internet or something like that, and you can be relatively comfortable and you can make snarky libertarian comments online about how we should do away with government and how taxation is theft and all this sorts of nonsense, because you've completely neglected your roots and the foundation upon which this individualism is built. See, when you take a look at a group of chimpanzees, they are not individuals. They act as a social unit. And they work together. They live as a commune. That's where humans came from. There was never a time in human history where humans lived as some romantic lone individual off in the forest, chopping my own trees and providing myself with my own security. This was never the case. It's impossible because those people who band together can create a more powerful tribe, and they will simply go and attack any individuals. They will rape them, they will enslave them, or they will kill them. So individualism doesn't work at that level. Individualism comes about later once we've got court systems, laws, taxation, a strong government, police, roads, and all this sort of stuff. Then you can be an individual. And even so, society oscillates between individualist and collectivist. And that's what spiral dynamics will teach you if you watch my multi-part series on spiral dynamics. Each spiral dynamics stage is either more individualistic or collectivist, and it swings back and forth. There's no sense of like collectivism is evil and individualism is the best, or vice versa. It's always finding the right balance and always a kind of an oscillating, swinging back and forth to find that sweet spot. And of course, it's all about what fits your environment. In certain environments, it's more conducive to be collectivist in your worldview. And in other environments, it's more conducive to be individualistic in your worldview. And if you happen to be an arch libertarian, that's because you grew up in an environment that has made survival easy for you as an individualist. That's why. It's not because libertarianism is true or individualism is the best or something like this. These are, fantasies you tell yourself to justify how it is that you're surviving, because you're not conscious of how it is that you're surviving and why you do the things you do, necessitated by certain survival conditions. Next, quote, "Simply holding elections will not establish effective democracy in the Muslim world," end quote. That was pretty obvious when the United States invaded Iraq under George W. Bush in the aftermath of 9/11. It was pretty obvious that it wouldn't work. Yet, we were bamboozled and promised by the likes of Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz and George W. Bush and all of his cronies, that if we just topple Saddam Hussein and throw him out, we can establish a flourishing democracy and everything will be nice and peachy in that part of the world. No, because the problem is it wasn't Saddam Hussein that was the problem, like I said earlier. The problem is the level of development of the entire population, their value system. You can topple Saddam Hussein, but you cannot change the value system of every Muslim in Iraq or Syria. You can't do it. They have to grow themselves through that. See? Saddam Hussein would have naturally been toppled as Muslims in that part of the world developed more and moved from survival values to self-expressive values. It might have taken 50 years or 100 years. There might have been other dictators that came after him. And of course, Saddam Hussein was a terrible dictator and he, brutally murdered many people. But on the other hand, you have to take into account that murdering of many people that he did. Why was that necessary? Was it because he was a monster? No, it was because that's how business is conducted in that part of the world under that value system. Because there are many conflicting tribes, and if you take out Saddam Hussein, you might get something worse like ISIS, like terrorism. So as bad as Saddam Hussein was, he wasn't a terrorist in the same way that that many terrorist groups are in that region now. He was actually interested in building a stronger, unified nation of Iraq, whereas many of these terrorists in that region now, they're not interested in that. They're interested in building some sort of caliphate, or doing other kinds of low consciousness things. And the next quote here is, quote, "Islamic fundamentalists see Western culture as something to guard against," end quote. See. And that's generally true of all secular trends. Every time there's a secular trend in society, there's always a countervailing fundamentalist trend. Fundamentalism is a reaction against the secularization of society, which is why there are Christian fundamentalists, Islamic fundamentalists, Hindu fundamentalists, Buddhist fundamentalists, and others. Because the world is becoming more secular, and as that happens, those old egos are clinging to the old belief systems that they're trying to preserve, old traditions. And so then there's a fundamentalist backlash against this secularization because they view the secularization as a collapse of society, as an existential threat. You see, if you grew up in a survival situation where religion was the sort of the binding force that brought everything together and gave life meaning and allowed you to survive and to thrive and to some degree, then when you see others trying to secularize society and remove those religious elements, you could look at that and you can say, well, great, that means we're going to go to the next level. Or you can look at it and say, no, that's terrible because that means we're losing all of our traditions and all the things that make us who we are. Of course, that's a fear-based egoic reaction, which basically all fundamentalists are prone to and guilty of. But you should also understand why it is that they feel that way, because they're afraid, because they're insecure, because they don't understand that the next level could be something that's even better than we currently have. You see, so if you want to really help fundamentalists, help them to see that there's a next level and that they don't need to be afraid of losing their fundamentalism. Of course, that's not easy to do because fundamentalists, by definition, tend to be very closed-minded and dogmatic and ideological, and they don't want to listen to what's coming next because they think they're already at the absolute best that there could be. You can't tell some fundamentalist evangelical that there could be something better than his current form of spirituality because he thinks his spirituality is the one true one. Well, that's his problem right there. Of course, that's not true. Maybe his spirituality was good at a certain point in time, but now it's time to move on to something better. But that requires an open mind. Next quote. Quote, younger birth cohorts and people born in diverse metropolitan areas are considerably more supportive of new cultural norms than older people and those from rural areas. As younger cohorts replace older ones, major cultural changes continue. So that's what I was talking about at the very beginning of these quotes with the inchworm inching its way forward. Old people die, new generations come online, and values evolve. And here I just want to show you one more chart, which is basically the same sort of data we've been talking about. Survival versus self-expression values on the horizontal, traditional versus secular rational values on the vertical. And here, though, you can see them, you can see different sort of groups, countries, not just as individual countries, but broken down into sort of, into these larger regions, like all of Protestant Europe or all of Catholic Europe, Orthodox Slavic countries, African Islamic countries, Latin American countries, Confucian Asian countries, some Baltic countries. You can kind of see where they're at and where they might be headed. Gives you a bit of an idea. So as you can see there, the African Islamic countries are the most traditional and the most survival oriented and also the least developed. Again, that doesn't mean they're bad or evil. It doesn't mean that they're permanently going to be that way. It just means that they have more growing to do. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the various insights from this World Values Survey data. Number one, human values evolve in predictable ways. There are clear trends with lower and higher. It's clear which way Zimbabwe and Bangladesh will evolve in the future. There's no mystery about this. It's clear which way Russia and the United States will go in the future. There's no mystery about this. Not in the long run. In the short run, we can have a bad election cycle, we can have some sort of nationalistic movement, we can have a war or something that will regress any of these countries. But in the long run, we know that they are moving in that sort of upper diagonal direction towards more self-expression values and towards more rational secular values. Another insight is that the largest increase in basic survival happens from agrarian to industrial societies. So countries that have not industrialized yet, they're still stuck in survival values. So industrialization is a very important event in a nation's development. And it corresponds to the largest shift in secular rational values. So highly industrialized nations tend to be highly secular and rational. America is actually a bit of an exception in this regard. It has a pretty strong kind of religious undercurrent that is being clung to by conservatives, come what may. Another insight is that survival to self-expression values come with increase in individual agency. So modern societies make individualism viable. That's what I was talking about with the libertarian stuff. Another insight is that the largest increase in individual agency comes with the advancement from industrial societies to knowledge societies. That produces the largest shift in self-expression values. Because in a knowledge society now, it becomes more important to be educated. And as you become more educated, you naturally want to express yourself more. Life becomes not just so much physical, but it also becomes more intellectual as well. And this sort of intellectualism spreads across society as more people finish high school and graduate from colleges. Another insight is that democracy is driven by self-expression values, not the other way around. If you want democracy in the Middle East, help them to advance to self-expression values, and then democracy will naturally flourish. But if you just depose some dictator and try to install democracy, it's not going to work because their values haven't shifted from survival values. See, so this is why war and brute force doesn't work so well for growth. You can't just beat a child over the head with a stick to get him to learn to read or to write or mathematics. See, learning is not about physically beating somebody. It's about showing them the value of learning, the value of growth, getting them excited about that, getting them bought into that. And that's a sort of a soft skill. That's a diplomacy skill. That's an education problem that needs to be solved. That's not a problem that you solve with bombs and rockets and invasions. Next insight, and this here's a quote. Quote, "The strongest emphasis on traditional values and survival values is found in Islamic societies of the Middle East." End quote. We already talked about that. Another quote, "The strongest emphasis on secular rational values and self-expression values is found in the Protestant societies of Northern Europe." End quote. We've sort of also alluded to that. The next insight is that desire for democracy is universal. It is not only a product of the West, as some people like to portray. There's a lot more commonality between human values around the world. Yes, there's a lot of different levels of development, but overall, if we give these countries enough time, we will see that they will develop into sophisticated democracies, advanced democracies with quote-unquote Western values. They're not really Western values. These are just values that come about when you get a certain number of your survival needs met and you become comfortable with that. When you move to a certain, second half of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, then Western values become everyone's values. Some more insights is that the higher your education, the more liberal you are. The younger your generation is, the more liberal you are. The less survival threats you face, the more liberal you are. So in generally, the conservatives are less educated, older generations, and face more survival threats. It's pretty obvious. Then I have a quote here for you. Between 1981 and 2007, happiness rose in 45 of the 52 countries that were surveyed in that period. So happiness is rising because our material wealth is rising, education is increasing, healthcare is increasing, all these things. So overall, the trends are good. It just may not be happening as fast as you individually want, but if you want to happen faster, then participate. You can get politically involved, you can vote more, you can be more active, you can volunteer, you can donate. There's a lot of stuff you can do. You can have a life purpose that helps to awaken mankind. You can become an educator. You can improve mankind's consciousness through your business and many other ways. Now, an insight about happiness. In low-income societies, a better economy leads to massive increases in happiness, whereas in high-income societies, more democracy, more self-expression leads to higher happiness. See, so if you're living in a high-income society, you need to dial off the economy. It's not about the economy, stupid. And if you live in a low-income society, then yes, you need to rapidly develop your economy because that's going to massively increase the happiness of you and everyone around you. But don't take it overboard. Realize when the economy has gotten to a level where now you're just getting diminishing returns. Now I want to paint you a little bit of a picture of how societies evolve, because that's the title of this episode. So here's how it works. Basically, human societies go from hunting and gathering to horticultural, which is raising of small animals in non-mass scales, then agrarian, which is basically massive farming, then from agrarian to industrial, and then from industrial to post-industrial, which is sort of a knowledge worker economy and a service economy, which is a lot of Northern Europe and America, Canada, and so forth. So we have the pre-industrial era, we have the industrial era, and we got the post-industrial era. And really, some of the key distinctions here is a citizen college educated or not? Are citizens interested in philosophy and science or not? Are they knowledge workers or are they manual laborers? These sorts of distinctions are very important for determining sort of the political trajectory of a country. most people are not educated enough for anything but manual labor. At least right now in the world, that's the case. As more people come together, but they are not very well educated, they need to be organized by some sort of higher intelligent force. And oftentimes, this needs to be through brute force because they don't understand anything else. So this leads to totalitarian regimes and autocracies and dictatorships and tyrannies, right? You have thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who are not intelligent enough to do anything but manual work. So what do? You corral them together into one group so they can defend themselves against invaders, right? And for that, you need some sort of tyrant or dictator. Then what happens is that as you're organizing these people, your population becomes so large that it requires more and more bureaucracy. Because, if you're only organizing 1,000 people, you can do that through word of mouth. If you're trying to organize 1 million people, now you need records, you need writing systems, you need language, you need accountants, you need bureaucrats to manage that for you. But these bureaucrats and these accountants and so forth, what do they need to be? They can't be dumb manual laborers. They need to be knowledge workers. They need to be intelligent. They need to go through years of education to learn language, to learn how to think, to learn some philosophy, and so forth. So as the population grows, education becomes imperative. And so we build bureaucracies that provide education, school systems. And then as more people become educated, those who rise to the top are not the manual laborers, but the elites who are the most educated. Because actually, the education and the intelligence it takes to organize manual labor is far more valuable in the grand scheme of things than manual labor itself. And then as we do this, as we create better organizations for our society, this leads to better and better economic efficiency, more trading, more opportunities for technology. As we develop more technology, of course, technology leads to better education and puts more demand on education because you need to be more educated to learn to use the technology effectively, right? You got to be pretty well educated to learn to use a computer and so forth. Some illiterate person can't just use a computer. So everything here turns into this sort of upward spiral where economic success leads to more education and more technology, and then yet more technology and more education leads to more economic success, and this creates this upward spiral until we get out of the rut of having to be worried about basic survival needs like food, water, shelter, and so forth. This becomes relatively easy to acquire after a certain point. And at this point, we've built up so much social infrastructure in order to manage all of this that now we are also much more socially interconnected with each other. And this allows for more self-expression to flourish. This puts pressure on people because they're more knowledgeable and educated to push for democracy. Now people are not just satisfied with putting food in their belly and clothing and sheltering their children. Now people want more. They want to have a say. They want to run for office. They want more civil rights. They want more gay rights. They want more sexual rights. They want more technological rights. They want free speech. They want all this sort of stuff. And survival, brute survival, starts to be taken for granted. And now survival moves into the more abstract, creative domain, the self-expressive domain. Values shift from the traditional survival values to now the secular, rational, self-expressive values. And now people demand democracy, where before an autocrat or a tyrant or a king could manage this whole affair. Now, people see the injustice of that, and they demand democracy. And so really, democracy is the fruit of dictatorship and monarchy. So if a king or a dictator becomes very, very successful at organizing people, eventually those people will overthrow the king or the dictator. So the king or dictator ends up undoing his own self. which is why basically all kings and dictators have a very short lifetime. They don't tend to live very long, precisely because when they succeed, they become irrelevant. And when they fail, well, of course, they also become irrelevant because they get replaced by somebody more vicious than them. Also, what happens is that as we have more knowledge workers and more education in a society, workers in general, rather than just being dumb manual laborers, now they have a more understanding, more sophistication. They think cognitively in more sophisticated ways. And now they are able to organize better with each other. Because you see, to be an effective knowledge worker means that you need to have more education. And the more education you have, the more free you're able to use your mind to look at the world and to see injustices in the world and to demand freedom for self-expression. And so higher education increases the need and demand for democracy. And as this happens, organized religions decline because with higher education, now we're more empirical and we start to question our own dogmas and ideologies. So we go back, we examine our old traditions, and we realize that many of our old traditions and religions and dogmas, they were not absolute truths. They were just vehicles to get us to where we are today. They were certain survival patterns and habits. And that now that our environment has changed, it's time to outgrow those. And so we outgrow those, and oftentimes we go more secular and rational. As this happens also, xenophobia, racism, sexism, homophobia, and elitism, all of these decline because all of them basically were coming from fear and insecurity. Once we become more secure in ourselves, we don't need to fight everybody for food and shelter and so on. And once we start to transcend and question our old traditions from religion, now we don't need to be so xenophobic. We can be friends with our neighbors, even though they're a different race or a different nationality. Now we can be more tolerant of different genders. We can see the equality. We can be even tolerant of homosexuality and so on. We're moving away from fear and towards greater consciousness and self-acceptance. Now, of course, as this secularism prevails over the population, fundamentalist movements break out as collective ego backlashes to try to go back. And this breaks out amongst people, those parts of society which are not as educated and are not being advanced as quickly to the cutting edge of where society is going. So basically, that part of society which you tend to leave behind and which you don't educate, that part of society which doesn't experience the economic prosperity that the other half of society does, they tend to get resentful and fearful, and perhaps rightly so, and they start these fundamentalist and nationalist movements. But these are temporary because, remember, the society still keeps getting more evolved, more wealthy, more prosperous, so eventually it will at some point all trickle down even to the fundamentalists, and it will make them more pacified and more secure, and eventually they'll be ready after a certain point to let go of their fundamentalism. Or if they're not, then their generation will simply die out, and the next generation will start from a cleaner slate and be less infected with those dogmas and ideologies. So the success of a previous generation creates the foundation for the next generation, which is free to be more liberal and more self-expressive. So this is how society works. And every generation basically becomes progressively a little bit more liberal than the previous one. The trick, though, is that prior generations don't fully understand newer generations because the past generations are still weary of the old survival threats. And nowhere is there a better example of this than, for example, in America with this whole debate around capitalism versus socialism. So today we have politicians like Bernie Sanders and others, AOC, who advocate for democratic socialism. It's not the same thing as socialism. But a lot of the older generations, the boomers, they are very leery of this, and they tend to conflate Bernie Sanders with an old-style Soviet communist, which is really silly. It's a silly conflation. But you can see how it happens because the baby boomers actually lived through the Cold War. So the Cold War was a serious threat to them. They grew up as children having to duck and cover under desks in school from the threat of a nuclear war from the communist Soviets. So of course, they still carry those fears. Those fears are deeply wired into their minds, such that when they're 60 or 70 years old, they're still stuck in that mindset. They can't see that what Bernie Sanders, for example, is advocating in his policies and his politics has nothing to do with Soviet communism. It's the next level. It's the level beyond capitalism, not the level that came before capitalism. So there's a conflation, sort of a pre-trans fallacy that happens there with the boomers. So that's because the old generation can't quite understand the new generation, which is why what's going to happen in practice is that all those boomers in the next 20 years are going to die. And once they die off, the new generations are going to be much more accepting of the label of socialism and the kind of politics that Bernie Sanders is advocating, which is why Bernie Sanders has the most support among young people under age 45, and why he has the least support amongst people who are age over 65, because they've been so threatened by the Cold War that they can't tolerate anybody with the label socialist. See? Now, who's right and who's wrong? Well, that's up to you to decide. I'm just trying to explain to you how some of these dynamics work. But also notice that when your opposition to something comes from a place of deep fear or insecurity, that ends up being a problem in and of itself. And what many of these baby boomers don't understand is, of course, is that survival threats change. Soviet Russia ain't Soviet Russia anymore. Communism of the old school type is long gone. It's not the 1950s or 60s or 70s or 80s anymore. There's no Cold War anymore. Things are different. Now, of course, there can be still problems with Russia. I'm not saying everything is perfect, but the situation has changed. Our technology has changed. Our culture has changed. Infrastructure has changed. Government has changed. A lot of stuff has changed. Society is not static. In those 50 or 60 years that the baby boomers were growing up, a lot of stuff has changed. So stuff that didn't used to work might now work. Think of society as a collective memory bank of mankind, baking in lessons from each generation for the next generation. So your children, when they are born, what's going to happen is that they are going to get programmed with the collective lessons of all of mankind from previous generations. Those are the lessons that they will need to survive, at least until they become adults. And then they will need to think for themselves independently and generate new ideas and new worldviews and new paradigms to take society to the next level. And so in this way, each generation is sort of passing on the baton to the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and baking in all those lessons within our culture, within our institutions, within our bureaucracies, our legal system, our language, our books, our technology. And see, layer after layer after layer, every 20 or 30 years, there's a new layer added on top of this thing we call civilization. And basically, society is growing just like a tree with those rings in a tree. Each ring represents 1 year or 1 generation, we might say. See, and it's progressively evolving. But the key is to recognize this entire dynamic from sort of a big picture perspective, from an elevated perspective, and not to get too attached to any one ring or to any one generation. One of the biggest problems we have right now is that the baby boomers are so clinging to power and their old value systems that they're not allowing the newer generations who have a better, more conscious worldview to occupy positions of power and make the change that we need. For example, right now, we badly need action on climate change. But many baby boomers don't want to lift a finger on climate change. Why not? Well, because they've already lived their life, so for them, why should they pay a lot of money to clean up the environment? To them, it doesn't make sense because they're going to be dead in 20 years. But to their children, it makes a lot of sense because they still have their whole life ahead of them. But the baby boomers have most of the wealth in society, at least in America. And they also occupy many of the positions of power politically and so forth. So, of course, it's frustrating for millennials and other younger generations dealing with these baby boomers because these baby boomers take all the money, take all the positions of power, and then they don't really want to advance forward as fast as we need to take care of some of these new existential challenges. See, when the baby boomers were born, environmental issues weren't a thing. Environmental issues are a relatively recent development. That's because the population of the planet has doubled since the baby boomers have been born. Think about that. Doubled. When people were born in the 50s or 60s, the planet was half as populated. That's crazy. That's crazy if you think about it. There are so many more people, which means that all of the problems that come with the scale, the mass scaling problems like pollution, trash, CO2 emissions, all of them are exponentially worse. And they keep getting exponentially worse if we don't do anything about it. See, but the boomers are not used to thinking in this way because they weren't raised with this sort of mentality. But newer generations are now much more environmentally conscious because they need to be for purposes of survival. Because now it matters when you have lead in your water or mercury in your teeth fillings. See, now this sort of stuff, we care about this because we know we have the science now to tell us how seriously this affects crime rates, how it affects the body function, endocrine system, glands, autoimmune issues, and so forth. And this is just the tip of the iceberg of environmental issues. So I just want you to notice how society is like a treadmill. It's always, or maybe even better, like an escalator. It's always moving up and it's always churning through itself. There's always new stuff being developed. It's not the same static old society of 100 years ago. You can never go back to how great things were in the past. This whole idea of make America great again, it can't possibly work because going back to the 1950s, that was a different world. There was half as many people on the planet in the 1950s as today. There were no environmental issues. There were no nuclear issues barely back then. The technology has completely changed. There was no internet back then. Everyone didn't have a personal vehicle back then. There were not certain diseases that exist today. There were not certain pollutants that exist today. Corporations were not as big and as powerful as they are today. A lot of stuff has changed and you can't put those genies back in the bottle. So we need new solutions, not just going back to the past. You can never go back to the past. You're never going to go back to a society with a bunch of coal-producing power plants the way that, Trump has promised. This is never going to work. This is fantasy. And this needs to be understood and acknowledged. The solution is not to yearn for some fantasy of the past, but to go boldly into the future, to face the future challenges, take them head on, and to deal with them truthfully, courageously, fearlessly, and to be visionary and to be innovative and to take some of the risks. Yes, it's risky to go into the future, into the unknown, but what other choice do we have? That is just the very nature of evolution. I've said in the past, and this is somewhat controversial when I talked about conscious politics, that liberals are more evolved than conservatives. And of course, this pisses off a lot of conservatives to say this, but it is nonetheless true. And this World Values Survey data is the proof of it. The trend of societies goes from traditional survival to secular, rational, self-expressive, from conservative to liberal. Conservatives are mostly traditional survival-oriented. Liberals are mostly secular, rationalist, self-expressive-oriented. Every generation becomes more liberal. Even if you're a conservative today, you're a liberal by the standard of your ancestors. Notice this. Even the most arch conservatives of today would never support something like slavery, whereas your ancestors would. Without any hesitation, they would support slavery. Why is that? Simply because what conservatism is about preserving the status quo, whatever it happens to be. If it happens to be slavery, that's what you're preserving. But if it happens to be, whatever conservatives want to preserve today, then it's that. Gun rights or whatever. Now, of course, this is all denied by conservatives. That's part of the whole problem. And conservatives will say that this is so biased and unfair to say that conservatives are less evolved than liberals. But look at the data. Look at the historical trends. Look at it in an objective way. Step outside of your ideology and have the courage to admit that maybe your ideology is not equivalent to all other ideologies. Maybe there's a sort of a progression here. And that is, in fact, what you'll find. But of course, that's exactly what you don't want to do as a conservative. You don't want to consider other perspectives. You don't want to consider the possibility that there might be better ways of doing things than your current ideology because you're attached to it and you're protecting and defending it out of a sense of insecurity and fear. Notice that. Today's liberal is also tomorrow's conservative. So also, if you're a liberal, don't get cocky because you might say, oh, Leo, I'm so liberal. Yeah, you're liberal now, but when you turn 60 years old, relative to new generations, you're going to look like a old conservative fart. And yet you're still going to cling to power and think that you're right. You see? Today's conservatives are yesterday's liberals. Humans 100 years from now will be extremely, extremely liberal by even today's most liberal standards. Today's liberals will be uncomfortable with the crazy liberal ideas of humans 100 years from now. But luckily, they'll be dead 100 years from now. So it won't be a problem. Which is why death is actually a very important component in the progress of mankind. If generations didn't die out but lived forever, this would be very problematic because the whole system would get constipated. Because you got to have a mechanism for flushing out old ideas. People who cling to power attached to old ideologies. But all of this doesn't mean that conservatives are evil or always wrong. Conservatives can still have valid opinions. I'm not saying that liberals are right about everything. Don't get so reductive and simplistic about this. It's just that there's a clear trend, and we want to be conscious of what this trend is. The arc of history bends liberal and democratic. You can clearly see that if you study history. The biggest obstacle to liberal democracy is threats to basic survival. This is the classic tug of war between fear and love. Basically, liberalism is more love-oriented, and conservatism is more fear-driven. Self-expressiveness brings back spirituality in true form after secular rational values. So this is one of the things that many scientifically minded, rationally minded, atheistically minded, and liberal people get wrong from this data, is they think like, oh, well, Leo, so this means that in the future, religion will be completely wiped out, and there will be no spirituality, and it will be just all pure secular and rational, right? And that's precisely wrong. In the future, what will happen is that there will be even more spirituality, but it will be more powerful, more authentic, more true, more individual. Conservatives practice a sort of dogmatic, conformist, authoritarian spirituality, sort of a top-down spirituality. Whereas in the future, when we get past the secular rational values, there's going to be other levels. This data here doesn't show you all the future levels that will exist. Remember, this data is only tracking what's there now. It doesn't tell you about the future so much. But I've sort of been to the future in the sense that, you can become more conscious and then you can clearly see where the future is. If you become more conscious, you'll clearly see that spirituality is going to play only a bigger role within science, not less of a role. But it will be a different kind of spirituality. It won't be religion from the old Bible sort of thing. It's going to be mystical experiences. It's going to be psychedelic. It's going to be meditation. It's going to be yoga and these sorts of things. Basically, everything that I teach here on Actualized.org with non-duality. So spirituality is by no means dying. And this is one of the problems that fundamentalists face is they think that, well, if we open the doors for science, that's going to kill God and kill spirituality. But the opposite is the case. It will only kill our old dogmatic ideas of God and spirituality. But actually, the science will open the doors for actually realizing God at an even deeper level and practicing spirituality at an even deeper level, which you can do with psychedelics, with various kinds of, scientifically tested meditation methods, and even brain training machines. I've used brain training machines to have powerful meditation sessions. That's science helping you to be more spiritual. So the folly of the fundamentalists is that they don't understand that actually science and secularism, this is not going to lead to a downfall of religion and a loss of morality and depravity and devilry. Actually, it will take us to a new, even better way of doing spirituality. Because true spirituality builds on top of rational secular values. That's what people don't understand. Fundamentalists don't understand this, and even the secular rationalist scientists don't understand this. But that's because there's another level that we haven't even talked about here. So liberals and conservatives are not merely polar opposites. They are not just two equal sides of the coin. There's a clear directionality there. Society never stands still, it's always evolving. No one culture, race, or group has a monopoly on democracy or evolution. We have a lot more in common than we often realize. World happiness is rising. Keep that in mind. Keep in mind that your values are not true or original in any sense, and that many of your justifications for your values and your worldview are really just self-biased and self-deceived. So liberals need more compassion and understanding of conservatives. Things like racism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, xenophobia, nationalism, authoritarianism are not simply moral failings. They are survival responses. This is something liberals don't understand. And if you're a liberal, I want you to understand the following. If you were born into a harsher survival situation, you too would be a racist, a sexist, a homophobe, a xenophobe, a transphobe, an authoritarian, and a nationalist. And if you deny this, you're kidding yourself. You are only a liberal because you happened to be born in the right place, at the right time, standing on the shoulders of giants. Thanks to them, thanks to their education systems that they constructed, thanks to the bureaucracies and the legal systems that they constructed, thanks to the government that they constructed, thanks to the amazing economy that they constructed, thanks to all that, now you can sit at on a perch and look down at others below you and call them racist, sexist, homophobes, xenophobes, transphobes, nationalists and authoritarians and Nazis and so forth. But if you just happen to be born a little bit off to the side, you would be the one who would be called these names by some other liberals. That's a very humbling thought experiment to go through. I recommend you actually contemplate that one and recognize how privileged you are if you are a liberal. You are only woke because you stand on the shoulders of giants. Liberals need to admit that conservatives are not evil, and conservatives need to admit that liberals are more developed. But of course, liberals and conservatives are mostly just happy to be attacking one another. Liberals love to attack conservatives as brutes and as hypocrites and barbarians. And then conservatives love to attack liberals as being airy-fairy and woo-woo and, unrealistic. And in this game, this name-calling game, it turns into sort of a mud wrestling contest. this stalls our further development forward. The difficulty of seeing social evolution is that it doesn't happen precisely until the current generation dies off. The mind tends to block out from its own view those things which don't fit its existing worldview, biases, and perspectives, which don't serve its survival. So when I talk about cultural evolution, how fast everything is progressing forward, many people might say, well, Leo, what? I don't see any evolution. What's happening? It's all sort of the same. You don't see it precisely because it's not in your interest to see it. Because if you saw all of the evolution that was happening all around you, you couldn't maintain your old worldview. And that would be very threatening for you. So either you're going to wake up to what I'm saying here and start to agree with me, or you're going to deny and resist, entrench yourself deeper in your worldview, stick your head in the sand, but then eventually you're going to die, as your generation will die, necessarily. And then it won't matter what you believe, because the new generation, your children and their children, they will transcend your limitations. So either do it willingly or not. But it's going to happen either way. You are not going to stop the evolution of society. No matter how conservative you get, you're not going to stop it. You can only retard it for a short while, but eventually you're going to lose. So my question to you is, why be on the losing side of history? Why not look into the future a little bit and be more open and accommodating of the new changes that are happening in culture and society? Be more open-minded. Be more willing to learn and adopt trends that are coming to you in future generations. Listen to younger generations than you, rather than just acting arrogant and thinking that you've got it all figured out. The reason many people don't see cultural evolution is because it doesn't suit their survival to see it. See? Many Muslims and Christians and Hindus don't want to admit that religion evolves. The Christianity of today is not the Christianity that it was 1,000 years ago, not even close. Totally different. Islam of today is not the Islam of 1,000 years ago. Hinduism of today is not the Hinduism of 1,000 years ago. And yet these things, this evolution needs to be denied precisely because then it creates a sort of a bubble where we could say, well, Christianity was just this one monolithic thing which has existed for 2,000 years. No, it hasn't, but that's a fantasy that's really convenient if you want to just defend Christianity blindly. Because as soon as you start to admit that Christianity evolved here and there and there and there and there and there, then all of a sudden you have to admit that maybe many of the Christian practices and beliefs you hold today and that you do, that they weren't even there. They weren't even practiced by Jesus. So you can't go back and kind of ground yourself in Jesus's original teachings, the way that many Christians love to do. And in fact, most Christians today have nothing to do with the teachings of Jesus. They practice and preach exactly the opposite of what Jesus would have practiced or preached. Many Christians in America today are pro-capitalist, which is completely absurd. If you think Bernie Sanders is a communist, what would you have called Jesus? See, but people don't like to think about these things. They just blindly sort of follow tradition. So in conclusion, I want you to notice how well the World Values Survey that we covered here corroborates spiral dynamics, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the corruption perception index that we showed a chart of. All of these things work together to sort of give you a bigger picture of what's really going on. That's what's so nice about all these models and all this data. Now, let me issue a few final warnings about the World Values Survey. Do not use this data to make some sort of racist, nationalistic claims or theories about how, oh, the West is the best because this data seems to show it's the most advanced and the least corrupt. That's only a function of history. That doesn't prove that the that white man is more intelligent or better or smarter or anything like this. Also, the World Values Survey, it doesn't show you the highest stages of development. It doesn't even go as far as spiral dynamics, because spiral dynamics will show you stages yellow and turquoise, which are barely shown in this World Values Survey. Remember, this is raw data from 1980s to 2020. And it's tracking, these are questionnaires that are tracking very broad trends. So if a trend or a set of values is not prevalent in society, let's say it's only prevalent in 1% of society, then this survey is not going to pick it up. And that's the case with, for example, spiral dynamic stage turquoise. It's so rare right now, so few people have reached stage turquoise that it's less than 1%, which means that it's not going to be present in these surveys. But in, let's say, 50 years, when stage turquoise maybe becomes 5% of the population, then the World Value Survey will start to pick it up more, and you're gonna see that reflected in the data in some way. See, but every model has its limits. Spiral dynamics is also limited, but it's not as limited as the World Value Survey because they're serving different functions. See, it's one thing to track what's already happened. It's another thing to anticipate the future and to track and kind of speculate about where mankind is going. I also want to warn you that don't get the wrong idea that secular rational values are somehow the end-all be-all. Not at all. As stage turquoise shows you, there's something beyond the secular rational. There's something called post-rationality. There's something called vision logic. There's mystical experiences. There's non-duality. There's a lot of stuff beyond the secular and rational. It's just that it's not very widespread yet, and people are still very closed-minded about it, which is why it remains sort of hidden. But it's there for you to access if you want, and my work will help you to access that if that's what you're interested in, if you want to reach the highest levels of human development. Keep in mind also that this is just one model. It's one lens that you can use to look at reality through. I like to use many different lenses. No one lens is conclusive or absolute, so hold it loosely. Don't turn this into an ideology or a dogma. Don't use this data to justify all of your personal biases and worldviews. That would be a mistake. Rather, use this data to sort of zoom out and look at the big picture, correlate it with other models, compare it with other models, notice its limitations. Every model has certain limitations. It makes certain assumptions. It has certain biases. Keep all that in mind. And the final warning is don't let collective conclusions limit you. So you might have heard all this, and then you might say, well, Leo, this is so depressing because I live in Bangladesh. And this seems to show that in Bangladesh, it's impossible to self-actualize. It's impossible to rise to stage turquoise. It's impossible to become a mystic. It's impossible to do non-duality. It's impossible to self-actualize. No, these are very general trends. Even in the lowest and worst of countries, there are people who can be at stage turquoise. There are people who can be powerful mystics and sages and gurus in India, in Bangladesh, wherever you are. If you really want to, you can do it. You as an individual is a very different matter than your entire society collectively. Now, will you face additional obstacles and challenges because you happen to live in a very underdeveloped society? Yes, you could. Could you even be in more physical danger? Could your life be threatened? Yes, it could. But not necessarily, don't get paranoid about it. It doesn't have to be. You can learn to be a conscious individual no matter what country or society you live in. You can find ways to make it work. If Jesus could do it 2,000 years ago, you can do it today. Right? So, in general, be very careful with these sorts of studies and models, because remember, these are generalizations that apply across millions of people. You can always be an exception to the rule. There are always exceptional people that don't fit these models. And if that's you, if you want to be mega successful, if you want to, rise to the highest potential of mankind, go for it. Don't let this be an excuse. Don't create some victim mentality around this data. Use this data to empower yourself where it can help you. And then in those areas where it seems disempowering, ultimately forget it, let it go. It's not serving you. Go find those techniques and methods that will serve you. Because in the end, what you ultimately care about is waking up, growing yourself, developing yourself, and then being a powerful leader in the world. So go focus on that. That's what you can directly control. You can't directly control what a million people around you think or believe. You can play a part, you can influence them to some degree, but ultimately, first you got to take care of yourself. Build yourself up, actualize yourself, then you can worry about how to transform people around you to be more conscious and more woke and more developed. So I hope that this World Values Survey has given you some deep insights into the nature of politics and culture. Really, if you use this lens, you can look at politics in a totally different way. All of the political battles that you see between liberals and conservatives and so forth, you should be able to break all of that down and see the silliness of it all. These battles between gay rights versus non-gay rights, or gender this or gender that, gender equality. You can look at all this and you can see how foolish it is from both sides that people are arguing about these things, like pro-abortion, anti-abortion. You can see that there's no truth in these debates. It's just people acting out their survival and adopting ideologies to help them to do that. And yet, even though that's the case, the sides are not equal. There is still a trend from conservative to liberal. Notice that society is constantly changing around you and constantly growing. What is it growing towards? Contemplate that. I suggest that if you do, you'll discover that it's growing towards more consciousness, more equality, more democracy, more justice, more love, less fear. And then the only question is, which side of history do you want to be on? Do you want to be on the side of love and consciousness, or do you want to be on the side of fear? Do you want to be on the side of selflessness or on the side of selfishness? That's up to you. But understand that fear will always be conquered by love, and selfishness will always be conquered in the long run by selflessness. And falsehood will always be conquered by truth in the long run. But then again, as some famous economist, I think, once said, in the long run, we're all dead. And that's the end. All right. That's it for me. I'm out of here. That's my website right here, Actualized.org. Come click on it. Check out my blog. You can find new insights and videos that I post there every week. Check out the forum. Check out the Life Purpose course. Check out my book list. Lots of books on this topic and more. If you'd like to support me on Patreon, go to patreon.com/actualized. There's a link also down below the video that you can click on, and you can chip in $5-10 a month. That helps to support the research that I do and sustain this channel. And I'm grateful for that. And in general, I just want to, I guess, put out a word of appreciation just for the fact that, I'm really lucky and fortunate that I get to do this content, that I get to do what I love most, which is thinking about these deep, heady topics, talking about metaphysics and epistemology, and earn decent money doing it, and able to sustain myself and able to, share this wisdom with you. Just to be in this position took a lot of work, and I'm really grateful to be here. And really, it's been amazing. The last 7 years has been so amazing that I've even sort of acclimated to it, to the point where now I take it for granted that I'm even able to do this. Most people are not able to have the kind of job that I have and sustain themselves doing it, and also share this deep wisdom with the rest of the world, help to uplift the world. This is what I've worked for very hard to actualize my life purpose. And if you want to know the exact techniques and principles that I use to do that, check out my Life Purpose course. In the Life Purpose course, I talk about the sort of mindsets and sort of worldview that I needed to find my life purpose. I give you exercises. It's extremely practical. So if you're one of these people that wants to live a life purpose centered life, where your life is not just about going to work, but about doing something for mankind, and of course, finding that fulfillment within it. If you want to self-express, speaking of self-expression values, then the life purpose is all about that. It'll help you to find your values. It'll show you how to express yourself and how to start to build some sort of career or business around your deepest passions and help you to find what that is and to get you a clear vision of a way forward. And I guess the final thing I want to say here is that a lot of people treat politics as just some sort of dirty side affair. That's not what politics is. Politics is extremely important. And it's more important than ever to infuse consciousness in our politics today. Without politics, there cannot be awakening. Because politics creates the infrastructure, the fertile soil in which the seed of awakening can be planted. There is no possibility for awakening in some terrible country which is completely corrupted and which barely allows you to meet your survival needs. It's very hard to awaken. Still possible, but very, very hard for the majority of mankind to awaken. So in the future, awakening mankind is not just going to be about going to a meditation retreat. It's about creating policies and bureaucracy and infrastructure and a kind of society and technology in such a way that facilitates that. For a meditation retreat to exist, certain technology and politics is required. A certain kind of level of government is required for that to happen. You can't just go to Saudi Arabia and host some hippy-dippy mystical retreat. They're going to charge you for blasphemy against Islam because they're not open-minded enough to that. You see? And that's just one example. There's a lot of political change that we need to make awakening more readily accessible, even in developed countries, let alone underdeveloped ones. And democracy is the way that we do it. And healthy democracy requires conscious citizens. And conscious citizens are created by doing this work that we're doing here. So it's all interconnected is what I want you to see. And it's time that we start to evolve our politics beyond the kind of stuff that you see on CNN and MSNBC and Fox News, or even on most of YouTube. The way of the future is conscious politics. And if you want to know what that looks like, go check out my 4-part series called Conscious Politics, Part 1, 2, 3, and 4, where I outline that a bit. And this episode here is an addition to that, and I will have more episodes in the future that help you to develop a sort of a political consciousness, get your mind thinking in the right directions, because as we're seeing with all the rise of various nationalist movements that are regressive around the world, in America, in Europe, in South America, we see these trends. It's more important than ever not to take our democracy for granted. It's more important than ever to talk about conscious politics and to stop thinking of politics as some sort of dirty business that some politicians do, but something that you gotta keep an eye on as you're self-actualizing. Because society is not just a collection of individuals. It's also a collection. There are collective forces involved. See? And you are part of this collective. And you are responsible, if you're conscious, you're responsible for what this collective is doing. There are certain things you don't like that a collective is doing, and you don't want them done in your name. And as a collective, ultimately, what are we moving towards? As I talk about in conscious politics, we're moving towards greater consciousness. So if we're moving towards greater consciousness, that means we need more consciousness in our politics to help us to build systems and infrastructure that will facilitate more consciousness. So stay tuned in the future, because we're going to have more political topics, but also not only political topics. We're still going to have a bunch of just ordinary individual self-help topics as well.